Today we're going to be disassembling and assembling the Winchester Model 94. This is a pre-64 Winchester built around the 1940s. First things first, let's go ahead and clear this firearm. All clear. I'll be using this vise to free up my hands while working on the firearm, and this scribe to point out different parts. Here are most of the tools you'll need to disassemble and assemble this firearm. The first step into disassembly is to remove the finger lever pin stop screw. Behind the stop screw is the finger lever pin. Once removed, go to the other side of the receiver and punch out the finger lever pin. Be careful not to punch out this pin too hard and lose it. Next, we'll be removing the link pin stop screw. Once removed, the link pin can then be driven out. Open up the lever and then remove the lever and the link downwards out of the receiver. Next, we're going to be removing the carrier. Start by closing it, and then on either side of the carrier are carrier screws, and we're going to go ahead and remove both of them. Make sure you separate the screws for reassembly. Now that the screws are removed, go ahead and drop the carrier out the bottom of the receiver. Next, we're going to be removing the stock, starting with the upper tang screw. Make sure you're using the correct size screw bit when removing any of the screws. Once removed, go ahead and remove the stock. Press this trigger stop and go ahead and release the hammer. Now with the tension off the mainspring, we're going to go ahead and remove the mainspring screw and the mainspring itself. Hold the mainspring up while removing the mainspring screw. Next, we're going to be removing the hammer link screw. This screw retains both the hammer and the lower tang trigger housing. Push the trigger stop in, pull the trigger backwards, and remove the hammer upwards. Now you can remove the breech bolt rearward out of the receiver, and then the locking bolt upwards out of the receiver. Next, we will be removing the lower tang, and I'll show you a trick how to remove it if you don't have a small nylon hammer. Place a punch in the vise, and then put excess layers of tape over it, and knock off the layers of tape. Repeat this 3 or 4 times. I'm going to speed this up so we can go ahead and move on. Now that your punch is ready, go ahead and punch out the lower tang. Stop at the very end. Be careful not to knock it off the end of the receiver and damage it. Next, we're going to be removing the spring cover, starting with the spring cover screw. Now that the screw is removed, the spring cover can be removed as well. I'm not going to remove anything else out of the receiver. This firearm has had some pretty rough maintenance over the years. I really don't want to make it worse. Next, we're going to be removing the magazine plug screw. The magazine plug will be under spring tension. Use your free hand to combat it. Once removed, keep holding pressure on the magazine plug and once you drop the plug, be careful for the spring tension behind it. Be cautious when removing the magazine spring. First step into disassembling the forearm is to remove the rear band screw. Once the band screw will no longer unscrew, go to the other side and punch it out. Slide the rear band forward off the fore-end. Next, remove the front band screw. Remove the front sight cover. Be careful not to strike the front sight. Again, stop before the end and remove it with your hand. Now that the band screws and the front sight cover are removed, slide the fore-end and the magazine tube out of the receiver. Now that the two are out of the receiver, slide the magazine tube the rest of the way off of the rifle. Rotate the front band and slide it off the front of the rifle. The rear band should slide off fairly easy. Lift the fore-end up and off the rifle. Grab your locking bolt and remove the firing pin striker stop pin. Next, we're going to be removing the finger lever link screw. Once the screw is removed, the finger lever and the link can be separated. Next, we're going to be removing the extractor, starting with the extractor pin, or by 2 roll cross pins and late guns. Remove the punch and pull the extractor upwards out of the breech bolt. Next, we'll be removing the ejector, starting with the ejector stop pin. Remove the ejector and the ejector spring. Next, we're going to be removing the firing pin rearward out of the breech bolt. Moving on to the lower tang. Next, we're going to be removing the trigger stop screw and spring. Now we're going to punch the trigger stop pin out of the lower tang. Remove the trigger stop now that the trigger stop pin is removed. Use a punch to remove the trigger pin next. Now remove the trigger downward and then the sear upwards. Alright guys, you've completed the disassembly of the 94 Winchester. Now we're going to move on to the assembly. We're going to start by placing the trigger and the sear back in the lower tang. You could use a slave pin here and just slide them both in the lower tang, but I'm just going to do it the old fashioned way. Line them up and slide a punch through. Once the punch is set, it'll act as a slave pin and you can punch the trigger pin through the side of the lower tang. Make sure the trigger pin is flush with the lower tang. Next, we're going to be installing the trigger stop and the trigger stop pin. Now the trigger stop spring and screw can be installed. Make sure it's under the trigger stop pin. Once the spring is under the trigger stop pin, go ahead and screw it down. Operate the trigger and the trigger stop. Make sure they are both functioning before moving on. Install the firing pin back in the breech bolt. Place the ejector spring back on the ejector, and then we're going to be installing the ejector back on the breech bolt. Compress the ejector and spring and place a punch through the ejector hole. Drive the ejector stop pin through the ejector hole. Compress the ejector to help push the ejector pin through the hole. Place the extractor back in the breech bolt. Then place the extractor pin back in the breech bolt. Make sure the extractor pin is flush with the breech bolt. Slide the finger lever back in the link. Replace the finger lever pin stop screw. Place the firing pin striker back in the locking bolt, and then place the firing pin striker pin back in the locking bolt. Place the magazine follower face first back into the receiver, and then place the front band back on the barrel. Slide it right over the front sight. After that, go ahead and slide the rear band back on the barrel. Rotate the front band. Go ahead and slide the magazine tube through the front band, rotate the rear band, and then slide it through that one as well. Place the fore-end back onto the barrel and slide the magazine tube back through the fore-end. Make sure you catch the magazine follower. Slide the rear band back onto the fore-end. Once it's aligned, go ahead and put the rear band screw back through the hole. Screw the rear band screw back into place. Align the notches in the barrel and the magazine tube. Once aligned, go ahead and slide the front band back over the hole. Place the front band screw back in the hole and start screwing. Place the magazine spring back in the magazine tube. While holding back the magazine spring, use your free hand to push the magazine plug back into the magazine tube. Place the magazine plug screw back into the magazine tube. Place the front sight cover back on the front sight. Next, we're going to be replacing the spring cover. Start by placing it in the receiver and put pressure on it. With steady pressure on the spring cover, tighten the spring cover screw. Place the breech bolt back into the receiver. Next, we're going to place the locking bolt back into the receiver from the bottom. While sliding the locking bolt back up into the receiver, compress the breech bolt so it will fit. Place the lower tang back into the receiver. Using a nylon hammer, hammer it back into the receiver. Make sure it's flush inside the receiver. Next, we'll be dropping the hammer back into the receiver. With the hammer back in the receiver, place the hammer link screw back into the receiver and start screwing. Do not tighten this screw too hard. You will compress the receiver and it will be very difficult working the lever action on this rifle. Place the mainspring back onto the lower tang. Make sure you catch the hammer while doing so. You have to catch the hammer before screwing it down. Make sure the hole is aligned. While holding pressure down on the mainspring, put the mainspring screw in and screw it tight. The more pressure on the rear of the mainspring, the easier it is to screw it in. Next, we're going to be replacing the carrier back into the receiver. Screw the carrier screws back into the receiver on each side. Pull the hammer back and lock it in place. Then pull the carrier back out of the receiver in an upward position, like so. Then pull up on the locking bolt. While holding the locking bolt up, pull the breech bolt rearward out of the receiver. Now you're ready to install the finger lever and link back into the receiver. Make sure the finger lever is placed inside the bolt breech. Slide the link over the locking bolt, like so, and pull up. Push the carrier downward into the receiver, and then the link as well. Place the link pin back into the receiver. Next, place the link screw back into the link. This will prevent the link pin from sliding out of the receiver. Close and lock the action. Place the finger lever pin back in the receiver. This pin is what locks the finger lever inside the breech bolt. It may be a little tricky to get this pin to go into the receiver. You may have to play around a little with the action. Place the finger lever pin stop screw back into the receiver. Place the stock back onto the firearm. Now you're ready to tighten it down with the upper tang screw. Alright guys, now you've completely assembled the 94 Winchester. If you like this video and you want to see more like it, please subscribe to the Amateur Smith. Alright guys, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time at the Amateur Smith.